Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Quitcast. My name is Becca Syme, and I am an author coach specializing in personality alignment for success. In particular, we use the Clifton Strengths metric the most often around here. But today, we're going to do something a little bit different because instead of just focusing on one character, which is what we've kind of been doing in this character drive series in the past, we're going to focus on two characters and very specifically on characters that have opposing traits. If you haven't seen the title, we're going to do Spock and Kirk from the Star Trek universe. And in particular, I'm going to handle primarily the two movies that were released with Chris Pine in the mid 2010s, I think they were. And I have reasons for that, and I'll explain them later. I am going to reference the original series as well. Uh, in a couple of places, I think it's more important than others, but I wanted us to talk about an arc. Because one of the things about conflicting strengths as methods of character development is that they work the best when you have an arc with a landing. And because the movies are very much an arc with a landing, and both of them kind of have similar themes to them, I wanted to talk about the Spock versus Kirk with some very specific conflicting strengths. The two of them have conflicting strengths with some very specific arc landings today because I want us to think a little bit about how to create characters that have opposition, in particular, like that have conflicts, even when they end up together, quote unquote, at the end, like they end up either friends or they end up, if you're writing romance or romantic movies, they end up lovers or they end up together. But on some level, they are not going to try to kill each other, which is often how conflict appears in fiction because it's very easy and resonant for us as individuals to have these conflicting traits that when they arise, if you have the opposite trait, it doesn't feel comfortable to have that around. And so you have to learn how to internalize what those traits mean for you if you have an opposing trait of someone that you care about. So when we see that happen in fiction, it's very resonant for us because many of us in our romantic partners, especially, and often in our friendships as well, we are opposite from the people that we care about or the people who are the most important to us. Today, we're going to talk about those conflicting traits specifically as a way of engaging character development and arcing. And we're going to talk about how they do Spock and Kirk. First of all, I want to talk about the conflicting traits themselves and why I think they're so helpful as a means of understanding growth arcs. In particular, you can do this with romance arcs. You can do this with any kind of enemies to friends or enemies to compatriots or enemies to lovers arcing that you're doing is picking traits that naturally disintegrate in the presence of each other, where they're so opposed to the way the other one is wired that it's just not, it doesn't feel natural. There's so much friction between the two of them that you want to disintegrate from that person. You want them to sort of be enemies. So learning how to integrate those two traits that are opposing is, again, it's the growth arc. And it comes from, and this is important, we've been discussing this in the entire series. It comes from the fact that the best fiction and the best characters in particular resonate with how real life actually happens. This is different from there being realistic because realistic, and in particular, character driven realism, is often way too complicated for the narrative to make sense because you really need, in order for an arc to make sense, it needs to have a singularity to it and a simplicity to it. Where if you were, let's say, a real person, you wouldn't only have one strength. You wouldn't just be a strategic person or an analytical person. You would have all kinds of other traits, including other metrics of personality alignment, which are not explainable, by the way. I think a lot of us want everything about personality alignment to be like co-regulated. We want them to be able to explain each other. But the reality is Myers-Briggs doesn't explain strengths. DISC doesn't explain Enneagram. Enneagram doesn't explain strengths. Like they're all completely different from each other. And people who are looking to simplify them too much are going to end up reducing people into boxes and then treating them not like real humans, but like numbers on a chart. And that's actually not helpful when we're talking about real people, but it's super helpful in fiction. It's extremely helpful in fiction because the more specifically you see the conflict, so strategic and analytical, and I'll talk about what those are in a second, but the more specifically you see the conflict and the more directly opposed the two traits are, the easier it is to find resolution. The more complicated something is, the more difficult it is to find resolution. But the easier, the more simple it is, the easier the pathway. So we see this happen a lot in, for instance, the grumpy sunshine trope, where you might have a high positivity person paired with a high restorative person. The high positivity is all la la la, happy go lucky, everything's exciting and wonderful. They smile all the time. The restorative person's very grumpy, very frustrated. They want to solve problems. They're, like that's the grumpy sunshine trope in a nutshell. In reality, it's never that simple. No one is just positivity or just restorative. And in fact, in reality, you could see restorative and positivity as strengths together. The problem solving person who is extremely upbeat and hopeful, you can have both of those traits together. But in fiction, the easiest thing is to be reductive in terms of the easiest arcs are reductive. And that comes from, and again, this is getting a little bit into the other purpose of these videos, which is to understand how to self-develop as well. So when I have a positivity trait, when I have a restorative trait, that trait has a development arc that I can go on. And if the problem that I'm currently having in my life is specifically related to, let's say, a positivity trait, then I know the arc that I can go on to fix that problem because the positivity arc is documented, right? So the conflict that I might be having as a high positivity person or a high restorative person is something that you're going to see almost everybody who has high positivity or high restorative resonate with those things because they're going to be common arcing problems, common development problems for everyone who has that. So there are lots of conflicting strengths. Positivity restorative is just one combo. That is the one we see the most commonly in romance when you're doing Grumpy Sunshine is to have a, positivity restorative. Other opposite pair combos. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the ones we see the most often. Woo and relator, the person who has a lot of friends and is very outgoing and has a lot of social facility. That would be the woo. And then the relator, who tends to be a little bit more closed off, have circles that are very tight. They want fewer friends, right? You could set them up to have conflict with each other because those traits are opposites or conflicting. Futuristic and adaptability is another one where the adaptability person's very located in the present moment, very present. The futuristic person always exists in tomorrow, always thinking about what's coming. You could create easy tension between those two. Futuristic and context also. Context is what has happened in the past and how did we get here. And then futuristic is forget how we got here, where are we going, right? Like that combo, you can create a lot of tension there. So, but again, conflicting traits will have some way of growing into a better version of that trait that often looks like growing a little bit closer to its opposite. So when you have the grumpy sunshine trait, if you're using it as a character growth arc, the sunshine person becomes a little bit more realistic by falling in love with the grumpy person. The grumpy person becomes a little bit more optimistic by falling in love with the sunshiny person. If you're going to use that as a character development arc, that's how you get them where they need to go, how to fix the downside or the problem that they're having, right? Activator and deliberative is another real easy opposite. The person who wants everything to happen right now, that's the activator, right? Catalyst, catalyst, catalyst. Very impatient, generally speaking. Ask me how I know. And then deliberative is the opposite, not the only opposite. Intellection can also be an opposite of activator, but deliberative is the opposite, where they take more caution in their decision making. They want to slow down. They want to make sure they make the right decision. Activators, we joke about them being ready, fire, aim. Like they're not aiming before they shoot. Although that's not always true. Again, real humans are complicated because I would say even my friends who are very high in activator and myself as well, that's not always the case. It's not always just shoot no matter what, right? Like that activate no matter what. But that's the common way that we talk about activator is ready, fire, aim. And it is very much the opposite of that deliberative, which is ready, aim, and then probably aim again. And then double check the aim and make sure the right, like measure twice, cut once, that kind of, that's very deliberative. So those opposite traits can create conflict where you grow to be a little bit more like each other in that development arc. And in fiction, if you can reduce it to something that resonates enough, and this is part of why I think Kirk and Spock resonate so much, is that they have a lot of these opposing traits where they end up through the course of, let's say, the original series as well, because you see this in them also. The first time I saw it was this episode with the boy that I think, episode 3 of the first season, a teenager who had been sort of raised by the ship, quote unquote, and you see Kirk and Spock playing chess, that multi-level chess when they can, and I forget what it's called, where they when the boy comes in and you see the two of them playing, and Spock says, "I don't like the way you play chess because it doesn't make any sense with logic," right? And they kind of have this conversation about how Kirk is making these decisions in chess that don't make any sense. And so what fascinates me about this is that there is this element of that in the original series. You just don't see it arcing as often, which is why I chose to use the movies instead, because it's much easier to see how they develop if you have a shortened arc, right? Where it's very focused. But strategic and analytical are the opposites that we see in the two of them. And analytical is Spock, and strategic is Kirk. We're going to talk more about what that looks like, but the opposition between those two traits provides basically the bones of their friendship arc throughout some of their individual arcs as well, like their individual development arc, but definitely their friendship arc. They don't value each other at the beginning, right? There's so much friction between the two of them because strategic in its complete glory, with no analytical to provide that friction to it, is somewhat impulsive. It's very intuitive. It is move with very little data, make a lot of assumptions about what the data pockets might be, and sometimes be right and sometimes be wrong. But the goal with strategic, because it has that ability to skip steps and anticipate correctly, by the way, this is the difference in how someone with high analytical would talk about strategic versus someone with high strategic would talk about it. Strategic would say, strategic, yes, it fills in, yes, it makes assumptions, but it's making predictive assumptions based on patterns that it sees, and then it's right 95% of the time, right? Whereas analytical focuses on that 5% as being not okay. Like, I don't want to be wrong 5% of the time. I want to be right 100% of the time, or let's say 99.9% of the time. I want to be logical. I want to be correct. And therefore, more data is required, more analyzing is required. And strategics will move more quickly than analyticals will. So you see that friction point between the two of them, that 5% becomes the deal breaker. And there are other parts of it, but I want to talk about how those opposites work together as we go through different points in the first and second movie, the Chris Pine movies, to illustrate this arc of the two different traits. And both of them, both Spock and Kirk, go through their own arc individually, where the misfiring of strategic that we see in Kirk, especially in his youth, and the indicator, which is really interesting to me, was that he was more so strategic because he grew up without a dad, like, or without his dad in particular. That there's definitely an implication that he is not as well-rounded of a person, because, which I would technically agree with, because having watched enough of the original series, I do think that Kirk was more often the what we would call mature version of strategic, rather than very much in the Chris Pine movies. You see him in this very raw strategic state where he's making a lot of assumptions. He's acting on his gut all the time. And it takes a lot of tension for him to get to a point where he's hyper logical. And in fact, the time when he is hyper logical is often proving a point to Spock. Like he's proving, see, I can be logical too, which he does sort of grow in that direction, which is good. But you see this raw version of the analytical with Spock, and you see this raw version of the strategic with Kirk, and the analytical. I think having again watched some of the original series, not every single episode, but having watched some of the original series, I think that Spock goes through his development arc with analytical in a very similar way in terms of the points that he hits in the arc, in the whole original series, very similar as he does in the two movies. So what's interesting to me about this is, they're making sort of a point about the divergent timeline and how Kirk really needed Spock to provide that difference in order for him to grow up and face some of these things that he's got to face. But Spock essentially would have done it regardless, except that, of course, Spock Prime, the time travel version of Spock, does say you're going to need Kirk to teach you these things. And that's why he tells him, like, you need to go to Starfleet at the end, because he needs the strategic opposing friction to be able to turn him into the version of analytical that is okay feeling his feelings, that understands that feelings are not antithetical to logic, that understands that you can have both feelings and logic if you can stay above the line. And this is so, so, so important. This is the growth arc of every analytical person who is dominant in their analytical. They have to learn this. And you watch Spock go through it in the first movie brilliantly. But I want to talk about Kirk first, because we need to deal with a couple of these strategic traits in order to get to the point where we can talk about what happens with Spock. So there are two hallmarks of strategic that I want to illustrate in Kirk, and both of which are part of his arcing towards becoming a less ready, fire, aim type of person about his strategic. And the development of strategic into mature is so often learning how not to be controlled by fear. And what Kirk doesn't understand, and I think this is very, very common with high strategic people, what he doesn't understand is that his fear of the no-win scenario is exactly what is holding him back. That he doesn't realize that he's already feeling fear when it comes to the no-win scenario. And it's part of what makes him madly scramble when he feels that no-win scenario coming on. Like, I will never be in a position where you take my agency away from me ever. And that fear, that never ever language, right? Which is what he's feeling internally. It's a very common growth arc for high strategic people, that they have to learn how to deal with this. I will only accept the best option. Because strategic is an anticipation strength, and it's always looking forward and trying to draw conclusions from paths in order to be able to find the best option. And we call strategic around the Better Faster Academy a best seeking strength. And there are several different strengths that have this common trait of needing this best option only. And the mature version of strategic will always deconstruct the best equals. So if and here's just an example with Kirk, the Kobayashi Maru, right? He will not tolerate the no-win scenario to a point where he doesn't even feel how afraid he is internally of that no-win scenario. He thinks that he's being so courageous and smart, but really that courage is coming from a fear of losing his agency, of losing his ability to have control over the scenario. He will not allow himself to feel fear. But by doing that, he's feeling it just the same and he is acting just the same in that way. And you see him doing this over and over in the movies until he learns how to integrate that because he's so caught in this. I will not allow myself to not be in control. I will not allow myself to not have this best option that I see, whatever the best is. And he decides what the best is very quickly, like a typical strategic. And once he decides, he holds so tightly to it. And that is the best seeking danger with strategic is if you don't allow yourself sometimes to be wrong, if you don't allow yourself sometimes to have the control taken from you when you need to accept that it's been taken so that you can deal with whatever the scenario is that you're being presented with. It doesn't keep you locked into this fear state where you're just constantly fighting everything, right? So this Kobayashi Maru example is he would not let himself experience this lack of control because again, it wasn't fear, he was already feeling fear. But he didn't want to experience this lack of control so much that he risked getting kicked out of Starfleet for it. He risked getting completely because he broke the rules, right? He risked losing everything just to avoid feeling that lack of control, that lack of agency. Again, not a bad thing to be committed to a no-win scenario, but to be that committed to it is a basement. We call the downsides or the unhealthy parts of strengths, the basements, and the healthier, better parts are the balconies. So a balcony strategic can handle like Spock did, right? Because balcony strategic has a little bit more objectivity of that logical brain, and the basement of strategic is all emotions with no connection to logic whatsoever. So this fear of the no-win scenario that Kirk has is so controlling of him. And he has to go through these steps where at first he thinks that he's won, right? Because yes, he does get disbarred or they suspend him, I guess, technically at the beginning of the first movie. But he still gets on board the Enterprise, right? So he thinks that he's won, but the reality is he still hasn't conquered that feeling, and he still hasn't conquered that fear that he has of the no-win scenario. And he doesn't really do that until the end of the second movie either, because he has to risk losing the thing that is becomes the most important to him, which is Spock's friendship, right? So, and I think this is so wildly important to understand that when you have in a growth arc, when you have the thing that they are the most afraid of losing, that's the thing they have to face losing in order to see that they can face the fear and be okay in the face of it. So, this is really different from being in an actual life and death situation where the fear is actually, I might die in this actual moment, like in front of me, it might happen. That is not a logical shift, right? Whereas with strategic, that fear of the no-win scenario, that fear of not getting the best, whatever we put on the other side of the equal sign of best, has got to be conquered, right? So when you see him sort of losing to that fear in the Kobayashi Maru, and you see him losing to that fear in the obsession that he has with going after Pike. And again, you really don't see him beating that fear until the very end, the confrontation with Khan. And I was about to say, I don't mean to spoil things, but we can't get through this without spoilers. So if you haven't seen these movies, I suppose you should probably stop watching, but you probably aren't watching if you have not seen the movies or the show. But that I have to have the best. There is no other option. Holding it that tightly. Strategics, when they grow, have to learn how to release that in situations where if you do not adapt to what is true about this situation, you will never be able to get past the hold that fear has on you. And that's really how he has to learn how to develop. And I think personally, I think there should be a third movie, not just because I think I've liked them, but also because I think in his real development with his strategic balcony, we need to see that be tested one more time, right? Because he sort of fails a little bit. It's like you have the try fail in the arc of the first movie. He does not succeed in beating that fear, even though he does get better. Like he becomes a little bit more logical in the first movie, and then he becomes significantly more logical in the second movie, but he still hasn't really conquered that kind of basement. So if I got to decide, which I don't, I think they should do a third one to kind of finish that arc because I think there that would be important. But I can't spend all my time talking about strategic. We have got to move on to the analytical, but I want to bring up one more thing really quickly because remember I said there were two hallmarks of strategic that we want to talk about, that I will absolutely not accept anything except the best is one. And that has to change into accept when not accepting the best is keeping me from my best self or keeping me from being integrated or keeping me from etc. Because that is the growth arc for strategic. The other hallmark of strategic that we see though with Kirk is that I just know intuition. I go with my gut. I just know. And this is less of a growth for him because I don't actually think this thread is unhealthy in him. I think that he's pretty, and actually, you see this in the lightning storm scene where he's got the really big hands in the first movie, where he hears that there's the lightning storm in space. And then he gets up and runs and he's like, somebody listen to me. We are going into a firefight, and everybody's questioning him about why do you think this, why do you think this? And most strategics, when they have this gut intuition, they cannot parse through all of the details with you in the moment because the data is coming at them too quickly. They don't actually know what it is that they're seeing. But a really healthy strategic is able to, in this particular trait, is able to slow down their thinking and say, okay, this happened and here's that detail, and then I heard from somebody else, and it ended up being Uhura, that there was a communication Romulan, et cetera, right? So he's able to slow down that really quick moving strategic pattern seeker and say, no, 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 listen to me, this is real. This isn't just me being an idiot and jumping the gun. This is actually me saying, like, I think there's real data here. And so he's able to slow it down and parse it enough. So this is just another reminder from just like a story development place that not every single part of a person has to be unhealthy in order for them to have a growth arc of some kind. Because I actually think that this particular part of his strategic, the intuitive part, is what helps Spock. Like, I think that's the piece where over and over again, Spock sees his intuition, and especially as you go through both movies together, and probably also if you include the original series, right? He's able to see that jumping happen in ways where there is actually data to back it up. We just can't always talk about all of it in the moment, but he sees that there is data there, and then he's able to understand, like, oh yeah, you have to feel sometimes, and it does help. We'll talk about this in a minute, but it does help that Spock got to talk to himself. Like, I think it helps to increase his trust in Kirk that he got to talk to himself after having lived a majority of his life, right? So I think that helps a lot, but I digress. It's also really important, just in shifting a little bit towards the Spock and the analytical, it's also really important when you have two characters, like if you had a grumpy sunshine, who are both going to impact each other, where you want the grumpy to become a little bit more positive and the sunshine to become a little bit more realistic. It's important that you see some positive traits of that, not just negative traits. And this is one of the reasons that we do a lot of you need to love all the strengths around the BFA, Because if I have a very, very low strength, like I have high activator and low deliberative. So if I have a very low deliberative strength, but I don't think it's valuable, then I don't let people who have deliberative into my life because it's uncomfortable. It is one of the least common ways that my brain works. I just have a really hard time empathizing with that deliberative part, but I have a best friend who's high deliberative. I almost always date people who are high deliberative. Just there's something about that activator deliberative pair that's like I'm keep trying to learn, I keep trying to teach myself how to be a little bit more risk averse, which is good for me. But Crystal and I, who's my best friend, we talk about this all the time about the way that that deliberative and the activator, they push on each other just enough, right? It helps her to be a little bit more active when she needs to take a little bit. I'm constantly doing the catalyzing of like, no, you could do this. Let's go. Like, let's make this decision. And she's learned how to take that in and listen when it's necessary, but then not listen when it's going to make her uncomfortable. Because that deliberative, and I'll use myself as an example, the deliberative lack means that my brain just does not function that way. I have a really hard time thinking with all of those pathways. So when I need those, I need some kind of skill in that. I have to go looking for what I already have. And strategic, because that strategic analytical, they both are pattern readers. So they both have this logical side to them. And in fact, a lot of people with high strategic will say, I am very analytical with a small a, right? Because they feel analytical because they've had to learn how to develop analysis, even if they don't have a dominant analytical trait. They've had to learn how to develop analysis in order to survive with strategic, because that strength is always getting questioned about why it thinks the way it thinks. So high strategic people have to learn how to slow their brains down, how to look at the pockets of data that they're filling in and look for the things that they have been collecting in order to make decisions. And that's what analyticals do already. They slow down, they take the data in, they look at all of it, they try to understand the patterns with a higher mass of the data. So even though a high strategic person will not become analytical with the strength, they become more strategic, more smartly strategic when they learn how to become more objective instead of so subjective, right? Strategic is the subjective, intuitive version. Analytical is the objective, more logical, more detached version. And both of them need to learn how to grow towards each other in order to kind of ascend into the best versions of themselves. Because together they make a really, really excellent smartness. It is moving as quickly as humanly possible because that is often necessary, but also being able to correctly and appropriately anticipate how much data we really need and how much we don't. So the part of analytical that needs to grow, which is what we see with Spock, is the analytical needs to learn how to be a little bit more connected to the gut, a little more connected to the feelings. And this is what I discussed earlier when I said analytical has to learn that you can feel feelings and logic at the same time if you're above the line. Because so often, what happens when analyticals or anyone, really dismissive avoidance, anyone who does this, disconnects from their emotions because it's so much easier to work if you just don't feel feelings. It's so much more efficient if you just don't feel feelings. But the problem is, feelings are action points. Like feelings actually give you action, even when you don't realize that you're getting action from your feelings. So those of us who are not good, because I used to not be good at this, at feeling our feelings, end up with, misplaced rage. We end up disconnecting and pulling away from people. We end up feeling a lot of guilt. We end up having, explosions, and there are all kinds of things that happen because we don't deal with our feelings. And it isn't that the feelings aren't there. And I think this is so important because every action on some level is motivated by a feeling of some kind. It's either motivated by four primary emotions, right? Happy, grateful, hopeful, secure. Often we mistake security, the feeling of security, for having no emotions because we are just not great with understanding our emotional range. So a lot of the actions that people who are high and analytical will take saying they're feeling nothing, they're actually feeling security. They don't realize that they've felt the positive emotions because they don't understand how emotions work. Usually, not 100% of people, but like this happens so often where people will say emotions are not helpful, they're not beneficial, etc. And yet they're taking almost all of their actions out of security, but often it's misplaced security, right? Because they're hiding or detaching from or airlocking all of their negative emotions and not taking action on those when they could take action in a place where they're above the line that is extremely helpful and easy to do. And it doesn't send you below the line. Below the line is where you're not in a fit state anymore. Like you're so controlled by emotions that you can't not take action in very big ways on behalf of them. So that was the moment with Spock, right? Where in the first movie in the beginning where we saw him as a child, that was the moment where he started to beat up the other kid because he got so in touch with his anger that he couldn't do anything else because he hadn't learned how to integrate any of his emotions. Because again, like this is the growth arc for people who are detached from their emotions. They have to learn how to integrate emotions above the line where they can feel logic and emotion at the same time. The only place we can't feel logic is when we're below the line. And they're so afraid of not feeling logical that they don't even want to go anywhere near the line. So they try not to feel any of their emotions. So there's a range of emotional states. And if you want to learn more about this, there's a doctor who specializes in this. Her name is Laurel Mellin, Mellin. I'm trying to think of which book you should probably read first. So I did a program of hers called EBT. Uh, yeah, I would probably go to Wired for Joy, although if you're high analytical, you're probably not going to love Wired for Joy. You probably won't love it, but the theory is really sounding good. She's a PhD and an MD, I think, as well. But anyway, this is something that is practiced a lot. Yes, in therapy and psychology, but also emotions are action points again. So, yes. So there are five states. One and two are above the line. Three is the line. Four and five are below the line. State one is all positive emotions. State five is all negative emotions. So logic still exists on the line and then above the line. Emotions still exist, right? Above the line and below the line. But so many of us, when we disintegrate from our emotions, and a lot of high analytical people, highly logical people, a lot of thinkers, five enneagrams, etc., feel like the only place you ever feel emotions is below the line. So, on some level, both negative and positive emotions can be dangerous because they associate emotions with being at a five state, because that so often is where emotions catch them. But the reality is, if you will check in and clear the emotions everywhere, so both four negative primary emotions, by the way, anger, sadness, fear, and guilt or responsibility, four primary emotions. If you will clear the primary emotions consistently and just feel them and let the action happen as it needs to, you can stay above the line all the time. You don't have to go below the line just to feel feelings. But again, I'm not trying to tell anyone that they have to feel all their feelings. I'm just saying there are tools out there. And often the reason that the highly analytical people, like Spock, by the way, cannot deal with their emotions is just because they don't have the tools to do it, which is why I suggest EBT, because it's exceptional at connecting the states to the different tools and teaching you how to exist in each one of those states with the proper tool. It is so good, so exceptional. It's really hard to find practitioners who do it because a lot of the current like holistic regulation stuff, embodied psychology and stuff that is out now has kind of replaced a lot of the EBT work, which I don't think it should have. I think EBT is the most logical, emotion-centered theory that I've ever seen before. And I think it's excellent. But anyway, because I'm also high analytical, not as high as my sister, who is a psychologist and very dominant analytical, but I still have enough of it that I understand what that feeling feels like. Like I can understand both Kirk, which is my number three strategic and also top 10 analytical, right? I can understand where Spock is coming from, except that I understand the five states now because I did all this work in my 20s. But this is the journey that Spock has to go on when it comes to integrating his emotions in a way that allows him to feel feelings, be present, especially be present to his human side, right? And then also only take action on the negative action points that require action. Because not all negative emotions that you feel require some kind of active sort of like, stop that, don't do that, like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right? Not all negative emotions require that. Some of them just require, well, there's nothing I can do about that. Well, I guess I have to change my thinking about that. Well, I'm gonna get a hug, or I'm gonna, in the scene where he's just lost his mother, right? I think Spock thinks that he doesn't need Uhura to comfort him. He thinks that he's fine. He doesn't see how much his body actually needs that comfort. And if he had let himself sit inside that for a little bit, he probably could have felt all those feelings and gotten past it and not needed to get into an unfit state, which he eventually did again in the first movie with Kirk. But the hallmark of analytical, right, is that void of emotion because they're so connected to logic. And they start off in this place where they're extremely void of emotion when they're in a very raw version of analytical. And then they end up at a place with integrated emotions. And this is so important. This is so important. They don't become emotional. They don't become intuitive. They remain analytical, but they are now a grounded analytical because at any moment, a set of feelings could emerge where they need to be able to process those feelings so they don't take inappropriate action on behalf of the feelings. So, what they need to learn, what Spock had to learn in that arc, was to learn how to integrate those emotions so that he could take action only on the ones that were necessary. But he sort of had to learn the skills of doing that by going there with Kirk, right? And I still believe in the first movie, his real turning point. I think the majority of the first movie is really about Spock's journey. Like Kirk still goes on a journey emotionally, but matures a little bit, right? But Spock has this opportunity to feel his feelings with an extreme catalyst, right? Like the death of his mom, an extreme catalyst, that extreme feeling like I'm going to suffocate emotion when he, tries to kill Kirk in that explosion, uh, emotional explosion, not physical explosion. And then when he has to recover from that and realize, hey, it's okay for me to feel these feelings. I'm probably going to have to be a little bit more connected to this so it doesn't control me. Because I think he feels how much it's controlling him when he sees the way that everybody responds to him. And he knows he's not in a fit state. He wants to stay in Starfleet. So he needs to be in a fit state. And he has to learn how to integrate. And then he has the benefit. And I think this is so huge in terms of even just the metaphor of this, of being able to talk to his future self. Talking to his future self is what tells him it's going to be okay to listen to his emotions and to integrate his emotions and to become more like Kirk. Even though his dad is there and he could have gotten some wisdom from his father, and he did get some wisdom from his father, it was talking to his future self, his adult self, that made him integrate, that made him decide, I want to go through this learning curve and I'm going to sign up to go back to Starfleet so that I can learn more about this. And then in the second movie, right away, what do you see him doing, right? You see him engaging in a no-win scenario, which was just hilarious. He was doing it in the most analytical consistency way ever, which I think are his top two strengths. Consistency. He actually says the line that is the most consistency line ever. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? When he's in the volcano. Anyway, so well done in the arcing. And I know not everybody liked these movies, and I know a lot of people who were fans of the original series, like I know not everyone who liked the original series liked these movies necessarily. But the character development in them is really brilliant. Like it gives the strengths what they need at each of these individual moments to be able to get through the arc that they needed to learn what they needed to learn. The strategic who needs to learn how to face the fear of the no-win scenario in reality and take the second best option when they are provided with it so that they can think logically and objectively, right? So on some level, they're connecting with that. I'm not going to be below the line either, even though generally speaking, that intuitive space is a little bit more emotional, but they're connecting a little bit more with their logic instead of being completely below the line. And then obviously the analytical, which we've just discussed. But both of those arcs in that first movie, especially, and then again, the strategic arc between one and two, they're so well done. The veracity of that character development is so consistent. So there are these skill chains that you have these different dependent skills that are needed like the earlier skills are needed in order to practice the later skills. Sort of like if I want to write in cursive, I have to know how to write an A first, right? Like I need to get the tail correct and I need to get the circle correct and I need to know how to draw that A correctly before I can move on to write in cursive or do calligraphy or something like that, right? Like the longer form skill chains. This also is true with individual traits. If I'm missing the skill of emotional self-regulation as an analytical, and not just understanding that emotions are necessary, which again, that's an earlier skill than in the skill chain than being able to regulate, which is sort of what Spock learns in the second movie. But he had to learn that it was necessary to feel feelings first, right? Like to learn how to value the feelings was kind of the first thing he had to learn. But every single step in the skill chain is required if you want to have this mature version of the strength. And for the most part, most of us are presented with opportunities to learn those things in real life. Like we're presented, if we're high strategic, with no-win scenarios, so that we have to learn how to deconstruct that best seeking part of us and only save it for scenarios where trying to hit that best equals equation is not going to rob us of anything that's good for us, right? It's not going to make us to be not in a fit state, something like that cost us something we don't want to lose, right? We all have to learn how to do that if we're going to mature our strategic. And being able to see it in fiction so well done, so resonantly, is such a gift because even if you don't like the movies, even if you thought that it was Star Trek and the Furious, which yeah, that was cute. I love that. Even if it feels like it was a little over the top or it wasn't as true to the original series, etc., it was so well done in terms of the character development in those two films. Just excellent. Very, very resonant. So I have to stop because we've been talking for too long, but clearly I could go on about this for a long time. We may end up doing more conflicting pairs in the future. I do want to try to find at least one grumpy sunshine that isn't from Ted Lasso. Because I feel like we talk about Ted Lasso too much on this podcast, but I want to try to find at least one grumpy sunshine. I would like to find a woo relator as well, and potentially like a futuristic context or something like that. just because I think the ability of seeing how the conflicting pairs can help grow each other is really beneficial to understanding how to write good character dynamics. So hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully I didn't say anything that offended any of the Star Trek fans too much. And if I did, I apologize. But hopefully this strengths information was helpful as well. So I just want to thank everybody for being here. This was a lot of fun, this episode to make. I had never really watched Star Trek before. Like I had seen maybe an episode of like the Picard season, I think I watched once. And then I saw the Chris Pine movie when it came out in the theaters and never watched the second one until just recently. But it was fascinating. Like I've watched a lot of the original series now. I've watched a lot of the Picard series. It's really been fascinating. I have a lot of good friends and people who are close to me who are very into Star Trek, and I just was always more of a Star Wars person. But we are not going to talk about Star Wars because I debated whether I would talk about this or not. But I don't know that there are any resonant enough characters in Star Wars. Like Han Solo, maybe as a self-assurance, but there are better self-assurance people out there. But there just aren't real great character arcs in any of those movies. And then I hesitate, to start this debate just because everybody has opinions about it, but it's much, much harder to find a really, really good character arc that has enough resonance and consistency in the way that the people are portrayed. It just, yeah. Anyway, I'll stop. I will stop. Han Solo has high self-assurance. That's, consistent even to the conclusion um, of his eventual final arc. But I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop because this is not a show about Star Wars. It is a show about alignment. And we have done our job for the day. So I hope that you come back next week or go back and watch others of our character episodes if you've enjoyed this one. We're going to do one more Buffy episode at some point. I'm so excited about the episode that we're going to record. I have a friend who is what I would consider to be a Buffy expert. And then my sister and I have both done some kind of study on the psychology of Buffy. And we are going to do a little bit of a nerd episode, nerd out about Buffy. And I am so excited about it to have the two of them on. So I'm not sure when we're going to record that and release it, but it's coming. And we're going to do more character episodes and more question the premise episodes, more stuff about the writing industry. But we have a lot of stuff behind us too. So please go and check that out if you're interested. And I hope that you have enjoyed this. I hope you come back. It was great to have you, and I will see you on the next Quick Cast. All right. Bye, everybody.